Um, Good evening and welcome to the Tata Literature Live 2022. I'm very excited actually to be part of this session. It's my first offline event and also the first offline event in 2 years for the Literature Live. And we also have two amazing Bombay chroniclers with us today who've had very fine debuts, I must say, in the recent past. Today's session, we are going to be talking, and it's aptly titled Eccentricity. We're going to talk about storytelling and the city that we're all part of and now we call home. You know, when writing about the city, one of my favorite writers, who also has written a Bombay book, Amrita Mahale, her book Milk Teeth, there's this quote, and I'll read it out. She says, "There was plenty of anger on offer in Mumbai, and it was easy to look away. But every once in a while, someone with imagination crafted their fury, like origami, into something delightful." Pronoti and Rehana's book, to me, represents that. So welcome the two of you. Really excited to have you all today and to dive right into the session. Perhaps what I thought we could begin with is getting you all to read short excerpts from your book so that we can give our audience a window into your work. So can we do that? Yeah? Pranoti, would you like to start?
Sure. So I'll just read a page, and to give you context, this is really about the narrator Maya's feeling about the city and a certain feeling of kinship with Bombay. I hope this explains that. Yet thinking about the historic coincidences produced a feeling of meaning and strangeness. From the beginning, I'd felt untethered from the world, like a balloon adrift. The sense was brought about by the fact that I resembled no one in my family, physically or in character. Shivaji and Minnie are short, the color of malt, and round-cheeked like a lot of Bengalis. Shivaji is chubby all over. Minnie has cartoonish curves, big breasts, a narrow waist, a generous ass. I'm tallish, absurdly fair with a lanky, boyish body, no breasts or hips, bony shoulders, hair as straight as my pin-like frame. There was not a gesture, habit, or trait we had in common. When I was introduced as their daughter, people couldn't help showing surprise. We'd learned to ignore the looks, but as a kid in school, it was hard to avoid the speculation. Kids, unschooled in tact, wouldn't hesitate to ask questions like, "Maya, how come you don't look like your mommy daddy?" I was afraid to know why, and so I lived with the feeling of being authorless. Like the Vedas, I like to think. I was appositely named too. Maya meaning compassion, but also the web of apparitions that constitutes the world. When I did get answers, the timing was significant. Every piece of self-knowledge was accompanied by a major event in Bombay. For every convulsion in my life was a parallel upheaval in the history of the city. As a result, I felt tied to Bombay and developed an interest in local history. I read books, took long walks in old neighborhoods. Often I'd have Kersi for company. Kersi, a yoga teacher, lives a couple of floors below me in the building in which I grew up. We were occasional lovers, and he supplied me with weed.
Rehana?
So I've picked something very different from Pronoti to read. It's also a different book, but I've picked something from Bandra because we're in a Bandra bookstore and it's around Christmas. So it's something very light. Christmas was around the corner and Hill Road was an overdrive. Cheap Jack was brimming over with streamers and tinsel, balloons and confetti, thermocol snowmen and glittering angels. On the pavement outside St. Peter's Church, Christmas trees found temporary shelter. In little kitchens on Bazaar Road and Baroda Road, marzipans were being nudged out of rubber molds. Rum-soaked fruits were making their way into cake mixtures. Sorpotel meals were being planned with families visiting from the Gulf and Canada. And across from Fizza's bookshop, Damien Furniture Store had put up its annual Christmas display featuring a life-size Santa, reindeer, and sleigh. I think a lot of this book is about my memories growing up in and around Bandra. My school was right there. And this time of year particularly, I think, belongs to Bandra in some ways. So it's tempting to read those bits. I promise you there's more than just Hill Road, history and geography in the book. Sorry, there's one more bit I thought I'd read. Yeah. New Year's Eve 2001. At about 7, Fiza decided to, this is more of Hill Road geography though, I'm warning you. At about 7, Fiza decided to walk home instead of adding to the crazy Hill Road traffic. She felt her body ache, but thought the exercise would do her some good. At her old school, a wedding reception was in progress. Ever since the spirited nun from the Delhi branch had been transferred to Bombay, they had begun to let the school grounds out for private events. Funds were being collected to start a junior college section. She stopped at A1 Bakery, owned by a schoolmate's father, who had always reminded her of that character from The Fiddler on the Roof. She peered, as usual, into the dingy Vienna store, where the faithful still bought bread and eggs, then walked past Holy Family Hospital, where the nativity scene was trying to infuse some cheer outside the emergency department. Past Sona stores, where last-minute party planners were buying balloons and masks by the dozen, and so on and so forth. So she's, a lot of my book is about Fiza, the central character, taking walks around Bombay. Which I think ties into the theme.
Right. Thank you so much, Rehana and Pronoti. I'd like to begin by talking about the protagonists. Now, both your books are very distinct because they have very, very different themes. But what I think is something that ties your books together, and I as a reader could not help, I found it very hard to ignore this is how the protagonists come together. Personally, I see two protagonists in both your books. There is a woman. Both of you have women. Pronoti, it's Maya, and for Rehana, it's Fiza Khalid. But then there is also a silent protagonist, which is the city of Bombay, that drives this novel. I'd like to know if this is how you always wanted to tell your story. Who'd like to begin?
Well, I was interested in a couple of things before I started writing this. One was the philosophical idea of meaning and how we create meaning for ourselves as well as meaning by way of self-knowledge. So Maya is someone who is clueless about her past. She's an adopted child. She doesn't really know who her biological parents are, and because of that, she feels a certain existential lacuna. And at the same time, she's a bit of a lazy character. She's stuck in a rut and unwilling to do anything about it. And sort of the narrative is really about her discovering something that spurs her to create meaning in her life. And I wanted to sort of fuse this idea with Bombay as a theme because, you know, I have a love for the city and I've been a city journalist for many years. And for the first book, I wanted it to be a sort of love letter to Bombay. Also, when you write a first book, you write about what's familiar. You write about what you know about, what you're comfortable with. And I felt I wanted to write about Bombay because Bombay was known to me. And so that's how I tried to sort of weave these two ideas together.
Both of you have invisible parents in the story, and I think that is how the novel opens without giving too much spoilers. There is an invisible parent who in some way is influencing your present and someone who you absolutely know nothing about, and the book becomes a quest to find out who this parent is. Is that correct, Rehana? And what the purpose of this parent is in your life at this moment?
Sorry, the purpose, the
parent
in my life.
In your character's life. Yes.
In this,
Yeah.
in the moment we meet the character.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So there is a progression. So the beginning of the novel, the protagonist Fiza lives with her mother. So she's had a single mother, and then suddenly this father who had abandoned them, well, abandoned in inverted commas. I don't know how people abandon each other. But yes, some leave. So she suddenly comes into a lot of wealth. This father that she never knew leaves her a fortune. So it's basically a very fairy tale premise. But then she realizes it's not so fairy tale after all, because you've got to deal with the emotional consequences of a kind of inheritance of so many different things. So yes, the novel is very much a discovery of, not so much a discovery of her father, because she only comes to know more about him after he's dead. And she discovers him then subsequently through a family that she never knew he had. These are all spoilers, but the book is 3 years old, so it's okay. So that was interesting to me, that you can discover someone who's so intimately connected with your life only after they've passed away, and in a way through other people who they chose to spend their lives with. So it's always interesting. Fathers and mothers, you can go on. And I think every book I write will in some ways be about fathers and mothers and Bombay. Yeah.
Well, I think for me it was two things. The father had to be absent because I needed a literary convenience. You know, it was convenient for me to have an absent father because I could not have continued that story. You know, his story is based on certain events that actually took place, and there's very little documentation on those events. So I had to remove him from the picture at some point. So it was very convenient. But at the same time, it was also a way for the protagonist. It was also to sort of give her a spur to do something with her life. You know, having an absent father and this journey of finding out about him. So it was like a mix of convenience and sort of storytelling.
Yeah. What amazes me is every time I read a new book about Bombay, I learn something I didn't know about the city. And you just realize that the city is a work in progress. It's something that you keep discovering, page after page, book after book. With your book specifically, Pronoti, what I learned about is a community, and just not a community, it is a community within a community. You investigate the lives of the half-bloods in the Parsi community. And it actually goes very deep. It's a deep exploration about the hows, whys, and what really happens to them. Tell us about the genesis of this.
Well, the genesis of this is a story that my mother told me. My mother is Parsi and she grew up in a small town called Navsari in Gujarat. So these events took place quite close to her. So she told me the story about a historic Navjot that took place. Navjot is a Zoroastrian initiation ceremony, I'm sure everyone knows that. A historic Navjot that took place in 1942, in which 77 individuals between the ages of 7 and 70 were inducted into the community, and these were half-bloods in the sense that they had Parsi fathers and tribal mothers. Now in the 18th and 19th centuries, Parsis controlled the liquor trade in Gujarat, in parts of Maharashtra, and they had the practice of living in the town. So you had the sects who lived in towns like Navsari, like Surat, etc. But their distilleries were in the forests, in villages. And a lot of them kept mistresses. So you had generations of halflings, you know, half Parsis and half tribal kids. And in the early part of the 20th century, you had some social reformers who tried to, get these kids into the Zoroastrian fold in order to give them access to education, community benefits, etc. This was met with a lot of resistance because, as you all know, Parsis are very hung up about the purity of blood. But this Navjot actually took place in 42, and there were a series of Navjots after that. And so this is the story that she told me, and I was quite struck by it because it was a hugely ballsy thing for a group of people to have done in the 1940s, and now it's just a footnote in history, but at the time it was a huge scandal. So I wanted to use this story in some way to spin a narrative around this story, and also to sort of challenge the received idea that we have about the benevolent Parsi. Yes, they are benevolent, they have a fantastic history of philanthropy, but they also have a sort of very seamy history which we don't come across as often as we read about, the more illustrious Parsis. So I wanted to spin a narrative around this. So one of my main characters, in fact, the absent father in my story, he had his Navjot in 1942, and then he moved from Gujarat to Bombay, and so it's about his journey from Gujarat to Bombay and the life that he lived. He lived quite a picaresque life in Bombay, so it's about that. But But this is like the kernel of the story. This is how it started.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that this part of history was actually reduced to a footnote. What kind of research went into unearthing the stories that you did, and how much of the history and the research that you put into this actually went into the book?
So there's not a lot of documentation. So I camped at the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute for a long time, like for weeks, months. I read as much as I could on Zoroastrian history. I read about this particular event and similar events in old papers like the Kaisar-e-Hind and the Jame Jamshed. And I was fortuitous to get my hands on a manuscript thanks to someone I met, like a man called Kaivan Umbrigar. He put me in, he gave me access to this manuscript, and this manuscript is by one of the people who was instrumental in organizing this Navjot of 1942. It's a fantastic little biography. And there were many people I spoke to. So like a lot of the book takes place in a fictitious bagh. So I spoke to a very good friend of mine who's an economic historian called Rashid Wadia about growing up in Nauroz Bagh in Parel. So I drew on a lot of his memories to to color those bits in the story. But yeah, there's not a lot of literature, so I had to keep that part quite brief. Yeah.
Right. Sorry, I just wanted to interject over here. Yeah. I recently read Such a Long Journey for the first time, and that was perhaps one of the, I found it to be very beautifully written, but I did have a criticism or a critique. I thought the women characters were written very poorly. Okay. And which is why I'm looking forward to reading your book, because it is the other Parsi identity, so it's very middle class to low middle class Parsis and sort of a chawl. Yeah. So economically, and you get to see the other side, not the illustrious Parsi philanthropists. Yeah. But I just found the women characters to be very caricaturish. Right. And so this gives me an added reason to read your book, I think, considering your,
No, I had some fantastic conversations with Rashid Wadia about growing up in Nauroz Bagh. And Nauroz Bagh, at the time, like in the 50s and 60s, had a very working class population. So you had a lot of Parsis who were taxi drivers, who worked in the mills, who were part of trade unions. And you don't associate these jobs with Parsis usually.
That's a very Rohinton mystery space.
Right.
But within that, the women were just written, I think, they were an afterthought.
Okay. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read Such a Long Journey. No, I have it, but I haven't read.
I read it during the pandemic. So yeah, I think you should.
Yeah.
I mean, if you wish. But it's that was one criticism I had in an otherwise marvelous book.
Okay. I haven't thought of it. I read this really long ago.
Miss Kitpatia and all, they're just caricatures, and all the men are written very sort of well-rounded figures.
But I think that's a criticism that I also got for Bombay Balchal.
Oh.
I was told that the female characters in my book are quite eccentric.
So are the male characters, no, Jane?
Yes.
I mean...
But you know that
everyone's,
yes,
I mean...
exactly. Everyone's crazy in that book.
Rightfully.
Rehana, your book draws me into the cultural and romantic facets of the city. The music, jazz, which plays such an instrumental role. The food, the vibe, the culture, bookshops. Does Fiza embody your fascination for this city?
I'm so grateful to you that you're saying she embodies my fascination, because everyone who reads it thinks I've written a book, I've looked in the mirror and or those women who sit journaling while looking at the mountains and they write a diary.
I avoided that, because I remember the last time I interviewed you, I asked you this question.
Because it's seen as journaling, right. Which I find very strange.
Same here. I'm always asked, is this you? This is surely you.
And that's your mother, and that's your father, and that's your lover. And it's very amusing to me, because to me, I was not interested in concealing things that are very obvious parallels. I did run a bookstore in Bombay. I did grow up in Bombay. I did study in St. Xavier's and all of that. But it was not my idea to conceal and, kind of be very obscure about the facts. There were some emotional truths that I was after. Yes, the cultural and the social milieu is interesting to me. Personally, I was going through a time in life that was very dark, and I surprised myself by writing a book that was anything but dark. So that was a bit of a surprise. It's something that came in the writing of. Jazz, for example, Fiza's mother, and people think that's my mother. And my mother read it, and it was very amusing to me because she's not a reader, but she did read my book. And she didn't see the similarities at all. So to me, that was great. she thought it was another figure, and that character is a jazz singer, and she works at a radio station. As far as the cultural thing, there's so much of Bandra and Kolaba because, like Pronoti said, write what you know, especially when you're starting out. Your book is set in Cavill, and you've also set it in a community that you are very familiar with, I suppose. So, yeah, your question was about the cultural and the romance. And of course, the romance of Bombay and the romance of books, there are relationships between men and women and men and all of that. But more importantly, it's about one's romance with the city and with literature.
Yeah. You spoke about writing about things that are familiar. And in a way, all our books talk about communities. I just saw Amrita here somewhere, and she also speaks about a particular community in her book, Milk Teeth. As debut writers, do you actually feel writing about something familiar is a good entry point for you?
I mean, it's definitely the most convenient, right? Because again, I mean, you're writing about what you know, and you're so uncertain and unsure as a first-time writer that, at least this is sort of reassuring. You know that I mean, of course you can go wrong, but if you're writing about what you're familiar with, you don't feel like you're in completely uncharted territory. So yeah, I mean, it is convenient. I mean, you write about Cavill,
yes,
which is a really interesting neighborhood, but like a lot of people, I think today might not really be familiar with the word Cavill. It's a word that's a part of the history of the city. So if I can ask you a question.
Okay. Yes.
What was it like writing about Cavill, and what kind of research did you do?
To be honest, if there was any research, it was the observation that I did. And initially, I didn't mean to write about Cavill. I'd named the town something else altogether. But the stories, people, and I'd been in that neighborhood for more than 15 years. So there was so much that was carrying with me. The stories, the eccentricities of people, their quirks, the food, the life. It was so different from what I had experienced in my childhood that I could disassociate myself from that neighborhood very easily and look at it as a flaneur, someone who was observing it from the outside. And that gave me great perspective to write my novel. At that point, I wasn't really thinking about, because it's a debut, I should be writing about something familiar. I just wanted to tell a story about something that I found very amusing, a space that I found very, that I found now losing itself in the city, in a city that's fast changing and fast moving. And I knew that in a couple of years, probably my neighborhood wouldn't exist. So now, why not tell the story of this place right now? I did not see it as something that would captivate people and draw people into the neighborhood. I just wanted them to be curious about smaller neighborhoods like these in Bombay that aren't part of our everyday conversation, but were very instrumental in shaping the city that you see today. So that is what happened with me. With regards to familiarity and, when we're writing about the debuts, things that we know and understand, I wanted to know if you all took any risks. Like, I tried to take a risk with a non-linear narrative where I had disconnected set of chapters, which then many people assumed were short stories, which is not. I keep telling them that Bombay Balcha is a novel. It's a short novella, but it is not a collection of short stories, they're disconnected stories. So I was trying to take that risk. I did not know whether it would work for me, but did you all see yourselves taking such risks with your books?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't really call it a risk, but I mean, I did wonder about what people would make of my subject matter, because the idea of sort of pure blood, it's such an integral part of the orthodox Zoroastrian identity, and I really wondered what people would make of what I've written, whether anyone would be offended. My mom was certainly worried. I mean, not me so much, but I wouldn't really call it a risk as such. I suppose the risk was the kind of risk anyone takes when he or she is putting themselves out there, or the written word out there. But
yeah, similar to what she said, but I think because, like I said, there are such obvious parallels between Fiza and myself. I think the risk is for people to, say this is me and, feel bad about it and identify themselves. And it is, we do it on social media all the time. So in a way, one is prepared to put oneself out there. I certainly am. But to do it through fiction, I think the risk was two parts of it. I didn't want it to be read as a Romana clef, right? Like there's a key to it. So if you know this, you know the whole story. The risk was in doing a mix. So there's Fiza. My friends always tease me. I tell them, Fiza's not me. She's tall, So that's my big cover. So there are similarities and there are differences. And then for me, the fear and the risk was for people to just think of it as my life. It happened. And now I feel I can take more risks. If people will believe that, then perhaps I can just forget about the whole question altogether. Maybe be braver with the second book.
Right. Yeah. All three of us have been journalists in some capacity. We'll get to that, the first part of it. But when I was writing my book, and I for some reason saw evidences of that even in your books, it's very difficult to separate research from storytelling. Inevitably, you as a writer dole out nuggets, vignettes about the city with the intention to inform, perhaps educate the reader about the city. When Bombay is just like a side character, like I said, a silent protagonist that's moving. Do you sometimes find it difficult to separate that journalist when whatever time, because both of you are not full-time or working journalists right now, but do you tend to sometimes find it difficult to separate that journalist from the author, the novelist?
Well, in terms of writing style, initially it was a bit of a challenge, because I felt I was writing a report. And this is what someone who read an early draft of the book told me, that this sounds very newsy. It sounds like you're writing a report. So I felt like, I think I was subconsciously getting into that groove, the groove of reportage. And I was, I think I was slightly didactic. It's like I was, my early drafts, a lot of the pages, they really read like Wikipedia entries, and that's awful. Like I can't bear to look at them. But that is something that I found myself falling into, that the pattern of writing like a journalist. So I had to make a very conscious effort to change my style, to write in a more novelistic fashion, and to not write as if I'm informing, as you said. So that was definitely a challenge, yeah. But in terms of the style of writing.
I felt that in your book too, and I think I asked you this question in some festival a couple of years ago. The tonal shifts when you're doing when you're informing and then you're getting into more novelistic thing, that is to me that makes a good novelist, because there's some amount of information and exposition and all of that.
Right.
And then how do you manage the tone of voice?
Yeah.
I think she does that so well in her book, because you inform, about the Goan migrant community and the differences between the Mangaloreans and the East Indians and the Goans and all of that. And that's information.
Right.
But then it ties into the characters and the space so well. I'm facing this in the book that I'm currently writing, because it spans, it's between the 1930s in Aligarh and 1970s in Bombay. And it spans those sort of post-independence era, and there's so much that happened, and it ends around the emergency. And just talking about the emergency through characters, it's very fake to just have newspaper headlines and quoting them. So I'm wondering how to weave it into the narrative. So yeah, it is a challenge, and I think it comes down to tone of voice. And just voice in itself to me is such a difficult thing to crack. Whose voice are you telling the story in? That to me, if you've cracked that, you've done a lot of the work.
No, that's definitely a challenge because we've had an English education, so we tend to speak in a certain voice. But then when you're writing about people, say from another class, another community, how do you write in their voice without sounding phony?
Yeah.
So I think one trick to do that, and I think a trick that a lot of writers employ, is when you're writing for someone else, you don't quote the person. You don't have open quotes. You don't put words in the mouth. You have run-on text.
Yeah.
You quote someone whose voice that you are confident of portraying. But yeah, this is something I think everyone especially Indian writers face constantly.
Right.
Yeah.
With your book, you switch between the first and third person, if I'm not wrong. Maya, and there's the third person narrator also in the book, in your book.
No, it's first person.
First person, right? But at some time, I feel that Maya takes a step back and you take precedence. That's something I felt in the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything to say.
But
Except
we're
that I'm
talking about first person narratives, and yours is third person.
Yes.
Yes.
But it's very tricky because you're writing in the third person, and then there's fizza, there's author, there's narrator. It's so many. It fuses in some way.
Yeah.
So I understand your question and your confusion.
I started with third person, and then I rewrote it as first person.
Wow.
Yeah, because
Was
I felt
it easier to write in first person?
I think for this particular book, it was easier to write as first. It was easier to write a first person narrative. I felt the third person wasn't really working at all. And I couldn't really express the mind, the psychology of the narrator in third person. So I rewrote the entire thing.
Entire book.
Yes.
I've rewritten it so many times, I can't tell you.
You're very hardworking.
Tell me about the rewriting process. How long did it take for you to get this book out?
Embarrassingly long. I'd been working on it for about 7 years, but for 3 years I must have written 2 sentences. So in all, maybe 4 years. And the writing process, as I said, my early drafts are embarrassingly bad, and I rewrote it several times. I got some of my friends to read it and give me feedback. And then I was fortunate to have a very good editor. And so I reworked it. Substantially based on the feedback that I got from my editor. So it's been through countless drafts. Yeah.
Rehana, you?
No. It is
Just one draft? Wow.
No. Not one draft. But I'm hoping the process with the second book is different. Because the first book was also one of those things that if I labored over it for too long, I don't think I would have gotten the effect that I wanted. So the first few drafts were sort of what we went with. But I don't know now. The second one is absolutely different. I'm taking a lot of time over it, and hopefully the editorial process will take time also. Editing process.
We might be digressing here slightly, but earlier in the day when I spoke to you guys in the morning, and I referred to you as journalists, and Rehana was quick to add that she's not a journalist, she's a features writer and columnist. And Pronoti said she's an editor of something very unintellectual. And at that point, and it's something that we women do very often, the self-deprecating or rather modest tendencies, sometimes unfortunately even self-loathing. Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing for us women?
Well, I think I was just being honest. Right. Well, I wasn't a journalist for a long time, but for the past 5 years, I edit content. It's very interesting, not particularly intellectual, so I was being honest. But if I came across as self-deprecating, I don't mind, because the best humor is self-deprecating.
That's true. Rehana, you want to say something?
No, I don't, I thought I was just being accurate. I've not been a journalist. I lack the rigor. I'm not a research-oriented brain. I did, funnily, a friend of mine is standing there. I did edit cricket websites for a few years. I don't know if that's counted as journalism, but it was nothing more than that. And the humor column is just, so.
Right.
And I think, Jane, you're just back from Bharat Jodo. So journalism to me is something that one takes very seriously. There's so much rigor, integrity, and courage involved. I wouldn't put myself there for those reasons. It's not really belittling myself, but it's just a different area altogether.
Okay. We're very quick to attaching labels when it comes to first books. For us, I think we get labeled as Bombay chroniclers. We have Bombay books, and maybe it's a Bildungsroman because that is the way the books move. Do you think that when your first book has this very specific label, like I know that I want to write about Bombay, but I hadn't, for some reason, after this book came out, it became a deeper exploration that, maybe I have to engage with the city more and write more about the city. Does it define the writing that you do, later on, perhaps your next books? Do you think that you'd want to stick to the same theme? You want to move away deliberately because you've been pigeonholed into this particular bracket?
Well, I think for now at least I'm done with Bombay.
Wow.
So the next thing that I'm working on, it has nothing to do with the city. There are characters who live in the city, but it's not really about Bombay. It's about,
Have you always lived in the city?
I have. Born and bred. But yeah, that's, I think I'm done. This is something that I had to do. I had to get it out of the system, and Bombay has just been such a big part of my life and my career for so long. It was something that I just had to push out, and I feel I've done that. And now I think I'm, ready to go beyond the boundaries of Bombay, which is what I'm doing. But that said, I am working on a book on Bombay food, so I'm not totally done. But this is
You're
not
never
a
done
fiction.
with Bombay, really.
But I
No
think
one
it
is
is
ever done.
it is a tag that can be a limitation, especially if you do, when I've done signings in Delhi bookshops and things like that, and the booksellers will tell you, oh, this is a Bombay book, it's a niche book, it will go in that corner. I don't understand, because it shouldn't matter where your book is from. Is it a good book? Is it interesting? Is it engaging? I think these are limiting categories. What are Delhi books? What are Bombay books? What are partition books? In the end, a reader will pick up a book irrespective if it's good
Right.
literary fiction or travel writing, whatever it is they're interested in. Part two of your question, am I done? I'll never be done with Bombay. I'm one of those very, I think, badly smitten people. The second book is also partly set in Bombay, but I don't, just like I don't see myself as relocating ever. I don't think my books can also move completely out of the city.
Right.
Yeah.
But now that you speak about Bombay books, for some reason I feel Bombay books has become a genre in itself because of the amount, the volume of writing and books that have come out from the city. I don't see that with any other city in the country. Have you ever thought why that's the case?
Bombay has always, I think it's a factor of being a migrant city. If you look at New York, if you look at London, these are all migrant cities. They all have terrific stories because you have, such a diverse set of people who move to these cities and sort of contribute to the stream of stories. So I think Bombay is like that. We've had such a, and it's not a very old history. It's a fairly like a recent history because Bombay only came to be what it is in the 18th century, in the late 18th century. That's really when Bombay started taking the shape that that it has, the form that it has today. So it's fairly new in that sense, but because it's a migrant city, it's sort of a fount of amazing stories, like, you know,
Yeah. Rehana, what do you think? Right. We'd now like to take questions from the audience. If you'll have something to ask to Rehana and Pronoti about their books. Yes, perhaps.
Just a footnote to what Pronoti said, the story of the 42 conversions was not, you see, the principle there was that a male Zoroastrian can get married to a non-Zoroastrian and children will belong to Zoroastrianism. In the case of these men who married tribal women, the problem was not that they were out of religion so much as that they were tribals or low caste or what. So they were seen as bringing in inferior blood into. That was the issue, because then and later a lot of Parsi men did marry outside European women or other communities, and that was never a problem. It was only when women, Parsi women, married out that the children were not recognized. So that was the issue. So here it was the issue of not that they married out of religion, but they married certain kind of women.
no, you're right. And in a lot of cases, they didn't marry. The women were mistresses.
Yeah, right.
Just to continue, actually, most of the time they didn't marry. These were rich Parsi landlords, and they had, in fact, in the middle of their fields, a special small concrete sort of little space created where they would sexually use tribal women, whoever attracted their fancy. And these were called avars. They were concrete little platform and a little cottage-like thing where whoever attracted them would be called, and then they would beget children out of wedlock. While the Warlis were quite easy about having these half Parsi. That they look it, I have worked in the region, so when I saw these very fair, light-eyed Warlis, I would wonder what had gone wrong where. And these were Parsi landlords' children. They were accepted by the Warlis, but of course they were not accepted at all by the Parsis.
Right.
So they continued to live in villages as they did. Some of them still there, totally out of, the sort of concern of the Parsi community. They were there, half Parsis, and they continued to live there. So I don't know why this 1942 event was organized, because there was absolutely no social pressure at all. At all. Well, most landlords actually had sexual relations and had so-called illegitimate children by the Adivasis or even the low caste Hindus.
Well, there was something of a movement among the offspring, among the adult offspring of Parsi men and tribal women, because they wanted to be part of the community and they followed many of the community rules. Like, for example, they would wear sadras but not kastis. They would have Parsi iconography, Zoroastrian iconography in their homes. They very much wanted to belong to the community, but this was denied to them. So there was something of a movement. And they did sort of, win a few Parsi reformers over who then helped them. And like certain priests who helped them get this Navjot done.
No, in the background was also the pressure of a diminishing population.
Right.
So that also brought in that these are after all children of Parsi fathers, and we need to increase the population of the community. I won't say more, but that was also a pressure operating there.
Okay.
So I wanted to just pick up on the last question that you asked. Lovely session. do you think there's something about the freedom to roam? All three of you are women. All three of you have written books about Bombay, and we're saying we're smitten by Bombay, with Bombay, whatever's the correct one. Do you think there's something about the freedom to roam that Bombay allows women that allows women to have a very special relationship with the city? Do you feel that?
I think so. I mean, I haven't really lived elsewhere. I mean, except Delhi for 3 years, but yeah, because Bombay is relatively safer. You tend, and it's parts of the city are lovely to walk about. Also, Bombay has this incredible history that is, I suppose, fetishized in a way. With local history walks and talks. That it does encourage you to roam and sort of women to roam more than in other cities, I suppose. And I guess one of the best ways to really get to know the history of the city is to walk around. Yeah.
Yes, now that you've asked me this question, I grew up in Oman, and my childhood was very restricted. So it was mostly indoors, and I think that did have an impact on the way I was as a child. And the moment, I still remember that day when I came to Bombay, and my parents were still in the Gulf, and I moved here, and I traveled from Churchgate to Andheri. It was the most liberating moment of my life as a 16-year-old, and it changed me completely. Bombay transformed me in a span of weeks, I would say, what a city like Muscat couldn't do in 16 years. So it does make you an explorer. It makes you a discoverer without you even wanting to, without you even seeking, because you're just walking and you're absorbing. You become like a sponge, and it does influence you as an individual, and makes you think differently.
I just want to add that Jane, apart from being a wonderful flaneur, or is it flaneurs for women? For women, okay. She also is such a beautiful photographer. City photographs. During the lockdown and everything, she captured Bombay and the slowness and the emptiness, and also the beauty, that a lot of people felt. I was not one of them. But she does it in two ways. So, and that is also very city, because you're loitering and you're roaming, and there's that aimlessness and freedom that you have with a camera or with your pen. So yeah, very much so, Bombay as a city of freedom.
Hi, my question is for all three, or any of you who want to take it. How did writing these books kind of did it at all change the way you saw Bombay?
I think I was so afraid of filling my book with Bombay cliches that it made me look at the cliches again, really. And then just because they are popular and they're stereotypes, I figured I'm going to put some of them in my book anyway, because they're still true and they still hold. So I did question things. I did think about that Pani Puri and the walk on bandstand and Kulaba and Churchgate and the Gothic spires and Gothic revival, all these very typical things about Bombay. And then I felt it would have been fake to take them out of the book, just because I feel people have read about it before. So I don't know if it answers your question, but it did make me question the cliches that I've always taken for granted. But I feel there is a newness, there's a sense of renewal, and there is still a richness to all of these symbols that I still take a lot of comfort and joy in. Yeah.
I wouldn't say it changed me in any way, but the research that went into the book, it just sort of exposed me to more layers of the city's history, and that was incredibly enriching. I read about stuff that I didn't know about, and that was quite terrific.
I think it made me see Cavell differently, because till then I thought I was just writing an ordinary story, and the moment my story started connecting with people, I felt there was something here that I hadn't seen until the book came out.
question, and I would like all of your perspectives on it. I'm a fairly new immigrant to the city, and I've known the city as it is today, and I'm in love with it. But all of you have spent your childhoods up until now over here, and do you see the spirit, the culture and romance, as you call it, of your city? Has it evolved over the years? Do new immigrants dilute or enrich this? Basically, the worlds that you paint in your books. Is it period or is it contemporary?
Well, I mean, it's period and contemporary, and one of your questions was, has the character of the city changed, right? Well, I mean, I think the character of the city keeps changing. 93 changed the city fundamentally, I feel. Before 93, I think we were not as, and when I say we, I'm referring to people of a certain class, of a certain community. I will not speak for all classes, but if you belong to sort of middle class, upper middle class Bombay, you had the privilege of not being as aware of religion as you became after 93. So that was a fundamental shift in the way one perceived the city. So like this, there have been many changes in the character of the city. Is it as inclusive as it always was? I mean, I don't know what it means to say always was, because, historic upheavals, historic changes have constantly sort of changed the way the city is. It's just constantly evolving. I mean, I don't think there was an idyllic past. Yeah.
But I do think, apart from the religion question, which of course things did change fundamentally in 93, I think even class and public spaces now, are they inclusive? Not at all, I think. There are demarcations, there are people like us who hang out in certain spaces. I grew up, everybody went to an Udupi, right? Now everyone's a connoisseur, everyone's a critic of food and of entertainment and this and that. There is no mingling, there really isn't, and that's terrible. Of course, we are at the receiving end of public policy, politics, all of it, but some of it is also coming from us, right? I mean, one is very ensconced in OTT subscriptions and certain kind of privileges that we all enjoy. So that, I do feel that. I feel that in the last 10 years or so, it's all becoming much more polarized is a wrong word, but we're all in our little cliques, and that was not the Bombay I remember growing up in.
Yes.
I went to a convent school, and we had all communities, all classes, everything mingling, and this to me was my idyllic past. I did have one in terms of my schooling. Schooling was free for people, for girls in schools in Maharashtra. Till class 12, I didn't pay. I think we paid 1 rupee for class 1. I went to an SSE school. And then in the college like St. Xavier's, you didn't really have to pay till class 12. And even after that, it was very affordable. I don't know now. My friends' children now don't go to convent schools. They go to schools that are very upper end. And you're going to Nassau on holiday, and which is great for them, but it's not for everyone. And I lament that. I think that's a big loss. We're all in a way complicit in it. We're all in a way victims of it. But it's sad, I feel. I wish things were more inclusive.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think my book laments the loss. So the book has a span of 70 years. Sorry. I'll just get the mic. So the book's... Hello?
Yeah.
The book spans 70 years, and I remember when I moved into Cavell and used to speak to elderly people, they would constantly speak about what they don't have right now. And that inquiry about what this neighborhood was, perhaps, and it spoke about what the city in itself, if you see the city in a larger context must have been, and why they feel the way they do right now. I think that whole process of understanding what I didn't have, the idyll that Bombay was, made me write this book. And by the end of it, they all come together and they kind of make peace with this loss, the sense of loss. It's foreboding, but you still want to love Bombay. And there is some sense of hope, and I'm hopeful that the city is changing.
It's that gentrification question.
Gentrification,
Any big
yes.
city in the world is facing it right now. So we're
Right now,
in
yeah.
the same.
But I would also be wary of, fetishizing the old in Bombay. So, for example, in a neighborhood like, the whole Muhammad Ali Road neighborhood and the sort of the changes that are going on over there. I mean, it's not something to particularly lament, because you have centuries old buildings that are being torn down, but those were like terrible living conditions,
Right.
They were very attractive looking. I mean, attractive to people like us who are walking on the road, these beautiful crumbling old edifices, but awful to live in. So, I think it's a bit of both. There's a lot that's changed that we wish didn't change, but there's a lot there's a lot of change going on that's perhaps not as bad.
Right. I think as a final thought, I would say that if there is something that we can hold on to and we can work on that, perhaps we should, we should try. We should make an attempt, because there is heritage, there is history, and we are losing it. So if we can hold on to bits of that, we should make an effort. So, on that note, it's already 6 o'clock, and we can call it a day. But thank you so much for being part of this session. You've been an amazing audience, and thank you for your questions.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Pranot.